It's day 2. Let's get into it. All right, guys, welcome back to Mealtime News and Politics. I'm your host, Henry. We're going to get into some real important news today, but before we even dive into anything, I wanted to touch on what I think, at least, is the most important revelation of yesterday, of the Donald Trump booking at Fulton County Jail. What we had all hoped for happened. They measured Trump and they weighed Trump, or at least purportedly did so. Who believes these numbers? I personally don't. But here's what he came in at. And if you had a betting line on this, you're going to be pretty sad if you bet the over. Donald Trump is 6 feet 3 inches tall, by that, give or take, 215 pounds, which seems about 40 or 50 pounds light. I know that when he was president, he clocked in at about 240. So anything under 250 seems a little implausible to me. But one of the tweets that I think is in contention for tweet of the day, it lost to what is an all-time tweet, so you can't be too mad about that. But one of the tweets that was exceptional is giving the NBA comparison of Donald Trump's build type. And Legion Hoops scanned the rosters and found that the closest build to Donald Trump would be Lou Dort. I'll throw the tweet up on the screen so you can see the picture comparison. But Donald Trump has the Lou Dort build, which I think even more testifies to the fact that that those are made up numbers. But to get serious, what is the point of getting a mugshot of Trump? It is a question that people have been asking, which is a super fair question to ask. I mean, traditionally, the point of mugshots is if there's a criminal of whom the government has no pictures or has no presence on social media, then a mugshot can be helpful in making sure that they can identify the criminal. But in Trump's case, the question is a pretty fair one, which is Trump is the most famous person on the face of the earth, arguably. I mean, you could make the case for some athletes, but Trump is one of the most recognizable people that's ever walked this planet. I mean, especially now in the age of social media when people on the other side of the world know what Trump looks like. So was there really a point in taking the mugshot? Was it just to show Trump that nobody's above the law and that everybody that goes through this process is subject to the same processes that happen when you're indicted and charged? Who knows? But the one thing that is pretty clear is that this probably helps Trump. Because this gives Trump what is maybe, and I'll put it on the screen again, what is maybe the most iconic image of all of his, 3 candidacies, right? There was the really famous one of him coming down the escalator in 2016 when he announced his first presidential run. In 2020, there weren't as many famous pictures of Trump that came out, but this mugshot will undoubtedly be, I mean, obviously the most trafficked mugshot in the history of mugshots, in the history of the world. But also, I think, one of the most emblematic pictures of this year and of this whole presidential cycle. And I think it does nothing but it gives, other than giving Trump and the people who support Trump, this image around which to catalyze their belief in their movement that Trump was indicted in this kind of superficial, not meaningful way is just a way for Biden and the Biden DOJ to get back at their chief political rivals. So whether or not that was a smart move by the prosecutor, unclear. It definitely puts that case front and center in the minds of people and in terms of what the media is talking about. And so in that sense, it is good for Fani Willis and her team, who I guess as a byproduct of this investigation also make a name for themselves. And, you know, Republicans would argue in some way advance their own political career. But one other important kind of outcome of this whole judicial mess that Trump finds himself in is that Trump will be in court for the next year and a half very often. I mean, it's going to be really difficult for Trump to juggle going to campaign events, going to Iowa, going to New Hampshire, going to all of these places where he needs to make a showing to get voters to vote for him, while also juggling these various cases that have been brought against him in 4 separate states. So it really puts in the mind of hopefully Republicans, if you know, Republicans want to elect a candidate who will go on to win in the general election, it'll put in the mind of Republicans, you know, is it wise to nominate Trump? Is this the best choice? Ultimately, will that matter because Trump has such broad-based support among hardcore Republicans? I don't think so. I think Trump's still running away with the primary, and there's basically nothing that can be done to stop that at this point. But it's definitely not going to help that Trump It's not going to help the Trump team that Trump will be stuck in court for the vast majority of the time between now and when the person who is going to be in the Oval Office for the next 4 years is elected next year. So let's talk about this kind of broader question that this brings, which is, at what point do you indict a president or any political officer, any political figure, even any public figure that has an elected office or is just really in the eye of the public? Because there has been this long-standing tradition that even if public figures do things wrong, that generally we don't get them in trouble, that generally we don't prosecute them. And this is dated back to the Hillary Clinton email scandal in 2016, when she was found having all of these emails that were on a private server that had classified information on them. And ultimately, do I think she had intent to do it? No. Do I think she really thought she was doing anything wrong? No. But was it still pretty clearly technically in violation of the law? Yes, it was. And nonetheless, she wasn't prosecuted. Then Director of the FBI, James Comey, said that in this case, we have to evaluate Hillary Clinton's intent. He basically wrote intent into the law where previously it didn't exist, saying that we're going to use our prosecutorial discretion, our ability to choose whom we prosecute, to decide that because Hillary Clinton didn't have intent when she was committing this crime, that we shouldn't prosecute her. And that was in line with this kind of broader, not narrative, but approach that the FBI and the DOJ had taken, which is to stay as apolitical as possible so they couldn't be accused of being a politicized department. Because so much of what they do, in fact, all of what they do, surrounds the issue of justice. And something that would be really bad for the country is this idea that justice is becoming politicized, that certain elected officials are using lawfare, right? Imprisoning their opponents instead of beating them in the realm of the public vote, right? And so for a long time, even when elected officials have transgressed, they've been immune to prosecution, more or less, because the Justice Department wants to avoid getting too political. But there definitely is a line. I mean, we have to think about, is there a point, is there an action after which, no matter who the politician is, no matter who the elected official is, would we prosecute them? And I think we would all agree the answer is yes, right? So for example, just to take the logical extreme of the issue, if Donald Trump murdered somebody, I think everyone in the country, maybe barring a few like crazy Trumpers and QAnon guys, would probably agree that, yeah, Trump should be prosecuted. But at the same time, if Trump jaywalks on a walk to the Capitol or something, people would probably argue that he shouldn't get a ticket. Or if there was some other minor crime that he shouldn't be prosecuted or given a ticket or whatever legal remedy would occur for whatever crime it was. And so given that, it raises the question of did Trump do something necessary to constitute breaking this barrier effectively in going after a politician? Because he has now been gone after 4 times, which is pretty significant and very likely could result in Trump facing jail time. And ultimately, I think that's up for a lot of people to decide. I don't think there is a good one right answer to this question of at what point do we finally go after a politician that has broken the law. I mean, Democrats in this instance will say, well, Trump threatened the core of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power from one leader to the next, which has been upheld by every president since the founding of our country and been a heavily championed idea in the United States legal and cultural history. And Trump kind of basically took a dump on that. And that's a really serious problem that has resulted in a lot of these cases that are justified. Republicans, on the other hand, will say that, the actual events of January 6th maybe weren't so bad, that there were only 200 people that ended up getting into the Capitol, that it didn't really pose a threat to our democracy, that the real problem was that there weren't sufficient number of Capitol Police there. And they'll give all of these arguments why it's not as serious and why it doesn't cross that threshold. But I think as a country, at some point, we're going to have to come to some conclusion about what is the threshold after which it is okay to, imprison a politician or to charge a politician. And I think what's going to happen, unfortunately, is now that that seal has been broken, now that the first politician has been gone after, then now we're going to see people on both sides of the aisle start to go after politicians for little baby crimes that in the past people would not have been charged with. So now maybe Republicans, if they take power, are going to go after Biden. They're going to say that the Biden family is deeply corrupt and that Biden ought to be imprisoned, assuming at that point President Biden is still alive, hopefully he is, but that Biden ought to be imprisoned and that Biden's family ought to be imprisoned. And I think at least in the short term, this is going to create a really hostile environment and a lot greater division between the two parties as each party weaponizes the law against the other because the seal has been broken. So whether or not it was justified to break the seal has been broken, and now each party will have their own take on if it was justified or not, and they're going to use the law no matter what to go after their rivals from here on out, is my prediction for what's going to happen. So now let's talk about the debate fallout, because we talked about the debate yesterday a little bit, and I gave some comments, like we talked about Ron DeSantis and his kind of weird alien-like smile. Talked a little bit about how Trump didn't show up and how he did an interview with Tucker Carlson and how Vivek basically fought the entire country except for those who like Trump, made a lot of enemies. So I said I would keep an eye on the polls for how that turned out for each of the candidates. So let's get into that a little bit. So there's a Washington Post and 538. 538's this really well-renowned kind of pollster that does a lot of statistical analysis in other areas too. They have great sports stuff. They did a poll of voters who are likely to vote in the primary and who watched the debate. And they basically asked them, who do you think had the best night? Now, 29%, the most number of people, the plurality this would be, because it's not over 50, but it's the greatest share of the remaining opportunities, said that DeSantis had the best night. 26% said that Vivek had the best night. But the interesting thing is that I think this helps DeSantis more than it helps Vivek in the aim of becoming president. So I think DeSantis did really well at a debate that Trump wasn't at, aside from the smiling stuff. I mean, his answers were well rehearsed and they were what I think the Republican base wanted to hear. And it did bump him a little bit. And I think some people who may not be happy, maybe a little on the fence about Trump, deciding between Trump and DeSantis, may have seen the Trump and Tucker interview and seen DeSantis engaging with the rest of the GOP field and decided that DeSantis is the candidate for them. So it probably doesn't help DeSantis a whole ton, but it helps DeSantis a little bit. Vivek, it certainly doesn't help with the aim of getting to be president, right? Because though 26% said that Vivek had the best night, Vivek also probably made the most enemies among people in the base. I mean, he really was off-putting to anybody that liked basically any of the other candidates. Like anybody that wasn't really open-minded to Vivek probably left that debate thinking that Vivek is the most annoying person that's ever made it onto a GOP primary debate stage. So, though 26% said that Vivek had the best night, the other, 74% that didn't probably think Vivek is the most annoying, most frustrating candidate of all 8, even including the really irrelevant Doug Burgum and Asa Hutchinson. So, separately from the performances that happened in the debate, and by the way, I think that 26% that do like Vivek, that does help him because those people are also the people that I think really are Trump supporters. And so that does help him, I think, in what his true aim is, which is to be part of the Trump administration, either as VP or, some other member of the Trump administration. So let's talk about Trump's interview with Tucker Carlson. It got 230 million views versus the 13 million that watched the Republican primary debate. Those numbers are a little misleading. It takes a lot more to count as a view on Fox News's debate than it did to watch on Twitter. Like, I think for Twitter, all you have to do is have the video like more than halfway in your screen for like 2 seconds. And if you reload or refresh, it counts as another view. So I think those are skewed, but tons of people watched Trump's debate. It was with Tucker. Unsurprisingly, not a ton of super hard questions were asked, but, Trump got to say a lot of his stuff and a lot of people watched it. Trump is still far and away the leading candidate in the GOP primary. It's overwhelmingly likely that he's going to be the candidate for the GOP going into the general election. So as far as how the debate impacted that, the final answer, as it seems, is not very much. Okay, so I'm going to put up a picture on the screen, but do you guys remember Yevgeny Prigozhin? Tough looking dude. Look at that guy. He's got big muscles. He's holding a gun. Prigozhin, right? Leader of the Wagner group. He led this mercenary group based out of Russia. They did a ton of work in Africa. They were kind of obviously affiliated with Russia, but not by name. So Russia could basically do stuff that was a little questionable through the Wagner group and basically shield themselves from any blowback that came from it. Okay, but like a month or two ago, and maybe it was 3 months, something like that, the Wagner group kind of led this almost coup where they marched towards Moscow from Ukraine, and they were very critical. The leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was very critical of the Putin regime or less the Putin regime, but more the generals that were handling the Ukraine war and how they were handling the war, and was upset because a lot of the fighters in his mercenary crew were dying. And he led this march that went, pretty close to Moscow. It was a march towards Moscow. And then finally, the president of Belarus was able to negotiate some or it wasn't a ceasefire exactly because there was not active conflict there, but he talked Prigozhin down in what seemed like it could have been a coup that would have thrown Vladimir Putin out of power, ended up being a big nothing burger. But since that point, people were talking, like Prigozhin's days are numbered. You can't do that to Vladimir Putin and expect to get away with it. So, lo and behold, Prigozhin's dead. Prigozhin died in a plane crash that was just the plane falling from the sky. Seems like it was pretty clearly caused by Vladimir Putin. I mean, Putin has a long record of basically just going after his political enemies or anybody that threatens his power. Alexei Navalny was Putin's chief political rival and a vocal opponent of corruption in Russia. And Alexei Navalny was recently imprisoned for something like 2 decades over some spurious charge that Putin basically made up to imprison him and get him out of the public eye. So it seems likely that Prigozhin was just killed by Putin. And that happens. Here's a video of the plane that Prigozhin was in falling from the sky. Doesn't seem like this was a coincidence. Seems like Putin got him. So let's move on to the next segment of the show, which I will call Flop Ed. And the premise of this segment is that I will talk about 2 op-eds, one which I think comes from the left and one which I think comes from the right, both of which I think make somewhat shaky arguments and all kind of dispute the opinion of these op-eds and kind of take the opposite side, not necessarily a side with which I agree. I try to keep my own personal politics out of the show. And I'm not saying what I'm about to say is something I necessarily agree with, but just to offer the devil's advocate viewpoint so we all have a better understanding of what people on the other side of the aisle from us are thinking. So let's start with this op-ed from this woman named Carol Markowicz in Fox News. And the op-ed is titled, "Disney is on a woke path to ruin. Even Snow White actress hates her own story." So this is part and parcel of this kind of conservative backlash against media that they perceive to be kind of motivated by a leftist agenda. And so the big uproar with the Snow White new movie that's coming out, the new live action Snow White, if you haven't seen the trailer, you haven't seen kind of stories that talk about the controversy that supposedly surrounds this, though I'm not really sure how much of an actual cultural controversy it is. But supposedly, tons of people are deeply upset about the fact that, one, Rachel Zegler isn't white, which seems kind of unimportant, but they're saying Snow White means that the actress must be white, which seems only like really an important thing nominally, but not really at all relevant to the story itself. Other than the one line in the fairy tale where it says her skin was white as snow, but a lot of the critics haven't really explained why, if that weren't the case, why the fairy tale would be any less meaningful. They're just kind of pointing it out. But yeah, so conservatives are mad because Snow White in this case is not white. And that the dwarves in Snow White have been recast as people that aren't little people in some cases, and I think one little person. And so there's all of these, pundits and commentators like the Ben Shapiro types and op-ed writers talking about how Disney is embarking on this path to unprofitability where they keep championing these leftist causes and it infiltrates all their work and it's going to kill Disney, this bastion of American culture and blah, 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 blah. So I think it's kind of ridiculous. Let's go through it. I'm going to read some of the article and then kind of talk about it. So this Carol Markowicz writes that Rachel Zegler, who will be starring in a live-action remake of the classic Snow White, slated to be released next year, has been on a promotional tour talking about how much she hates Snow White. So the first thing that I take issue with here is this idea that this lead actor hates Snow White, which I think is really unfounded. I mean, she's doing a movie based on Snow White. I think it's hard to say that she really hates the movie. But beyond that, she has been in some ways critical of how Snow White was initially portrayed. But I don't think those criticisms are entirely unfounded. And I think in some cases, they're intentionally taking her criticisms out of context and portraying them to be meaning something which is other than what she actually means, or at least what I think she actually means, which is that when this, fairy tale originally came out and was originally converted into a movie, was during a time where just women culturally were treated as more docile and servile and not the main characters and the object of male affection. And so in a time where that's less so the case, even though to some extent it still is, the movie should reflect that changing cultural moment. And she's not saying that, the love story is not an important part of Snow White. She's saying if her character finds love along the way, that's great, which is a part of Snow White, and I'm positive will be part of the movie, because I don't know how they could make Snow White without that part of the movie. But she's not criticizing and pooping on the whole idea of Snow White. That's just a silly interpretation of her points. What else did this Carol say? Carol said, perhaps Ziegler has never read a fairy tale before. Generally, the dashing prince doesn't submit a 5-page letter of consent to the princess in order to wake her from the evil spell she has been put under by a witch. Okay, fair enough, funny line. The 5-page letter of consent, decent dig. But it is, while it's funny, it's not what Zegler is saying. She's just saying, we need to portray Snow White in a way that's empowering to young girls, so young girls can look up to her as a figure that shows them they can be leaders, they can be powerful people. This girl boss, this term, I guess kind of a term of art, girl boss, has been, I think, in many ways commodified by the right to demean people like women, obviously, that want to pursue important goals for themselves that are outside of the family. And I think what that really kind of puts aside is the idea that women can do both, just like men can do both. Like, men obviously have career aspirations and are involved with their own family. Women similarly can have career aspirations and aspirations of power in the workplace, power in society, and still be involved in their own family. And conservatives are incredibly critical of that idea, but I don't think that's a fair characterization of what Zegler was truly trying to say. Okay, so Carol writes, it doesn't help that the rewrite also scraps the dwarves in favor of magical creatures of various physical descriptions. So I think this is the weakest of, truthfully, I think they're all weak, but I think this criticism is the weakest of the criticisms of the new live action Snow White, because what it relies upon is this logical assumption that the only way the dwarves make sense is if they're little people, which is, you can't argue that that's demeaning. Like, if you're saying that these helper people who are asexual, like that idea of saying that could only make sense if it were little people actually is, like, that is offensive, right? And that is a genuinely good reason to recast those people is not just little people that have dwarfism. So I think, once again, it's kind of a silly argument. It's also kind of a stupid argument. It doesn't reflect a deep amount of thinking about this issue. Finally, she says, with no love story, no whimsical wonder, and no dwarves, is it even Snow White anymore? So let's just go through them. No love story. I'd bet $1,000 that love makes an appearance in the Snow White. No whimsical wonder, she writes. Seems like a pretty subjective point. I'm sure that the Disney producers are going to try to incorporate whim and wonder into this, and whimsical wonder, if that's somehow different than the two separately. No dwarves, just address that. It is Snow White. It is still Snow White. I mean, it's the same story, just with a few minor changes. I think it's reflective of this now conservative approach, which is to take anything where the story's been changed or where it has more diverse casting and assert that this is shoving an agenda down your throat. When I think in many ways this could possibly be happenstance. I think in many cases, like, certainly there were times where probably there was an intentional inclusion effort, right, to have more diverse casting. But now I think we're to a point where the people, I guess you could say, that are running this, who conservatives would accuse of being on the left, just don't really care. And the right seems to be kind of late to this revelation. And so they're now still thinking that every instance of where somebody that's more, I guess, diverse is cast in a role that previously was a white woman, that must be diversity and leftism getting shoved down their throat, which I think is wrong, and I think is just not really paying close enough attention to where the cultural zeitgeist is right now. But yeah, I think also, the film's still going to do well. Like, Barbie got incredible conservative criticism. Like, Ben Shapiro put out like a 43-minute video on how much Barbie was going to flop. Barbie ended up doing incredibly well, right? So I think this will still probably end up doing well. Okay, now for the op-ed on the left that I want to disagree with, because, again, none of this is reflective of my true political beliefs. I'm just spitballing arguments here, playing devil's advocate. Okay, so this one is a guest essay in the New York Times, and it's written by somebody named, and I don't know if it's Jamieson, because it's spelled like Jamie Son, or Jameson, which would make more sense. Jameson Webster, we'll go with Jameson. And the title is, you ready for this? I don't need to be a good person in quotes, neither do you, which I think starts to tell the tale of what we're in for. So let's start. She writes, the promised image of goodness skirts pleasures that, for obscure reasons, you aren't sure you can want. Importantly, you come to see that limits cannot be held or crossed under compulsion. They must be approached freely. So she's a therapist based out of New York that's talking about her experience and kind of how this has shaped what she thinks about the human condition and our approach towards pleasure and desire, and kind of how we think of those hedonic desires in our life, and whether or not we should approach those freely, or whether or not we should try to curb those and rein those in, or even suppress those. So it's kind of a psychological take written in this very prosaic way about that question. So again, she says, importantly, you come to see that limits cannot be held or crossed under compulsion. They must be approached freely. She's referring to the limits that you place on your own desires. And I think my guess, giving her the benefit of the doubt, is that she's referring to desires that may be just a little like outside the norm or outside of what you think you're supposed to do. But I do take issue with this because it's very obviously not generalizable advice, right? So there's like a small group of desires for which, yeah, maybe this is fine advice, but certainly probably not even good advice, but like fine advice, and honestly not that revelatory. Like, people try new things all the time. But like the part where it could be like a revelatory thing, where it could be like, oh wow, I hadn't thought about this before, it's obviously stupid. Like, there's so many desires that we shouldn't approach freely that people have, right? So people may have a desire to steal because it's free stuff, right? People may have a desire to cheat on their spouse, right? Bad desire, should be quelled. People may have a desire to hurt somebody when they feel angry or when they feel like that person wronged them. Obviously a bad desire. And like, it raises the question of like, what is she trying to say? Is she trying to say, for desires that are like, oh, I want to try this new sexual thing in the bedroom with my partner, should I allow myself to think about that? Like, that question has already been answered. Yes, fine, whatever. Just talk with your partner about it. But if she's making the broader point, which this advice would go to, which is that you should entertain desires, kind of wallow in them to figure yourself out, that's one of the, I think, the worst ideas you could possibly entertain. Let's keep going. She says, after a futile struggle, and this is somewhat reflective of, I'll just read it. After a futile struggle with my son over Call of Duty, I finally heard what drew him to play. The twisted entertainment of uttering the most obscene, vicious, and yes, witty words for the kill cam seen by the other player before being exited from the video game. I had little sense he was honing his verbal acuity by playing when I set out to curb him. Interesting. Not sure that if I had kids, I would put them on Call of Duty with voice chat to hone their verbal acuity, in her words. Maybe have a discussion with your kid or have them watch this show. Onward, she says, I find that it's when we dwell on our secret enjoyments that we learn the most about ourselves. Sexual and aggressive feelings, veering self-destructive, are finally confronted without the veneer of rationalization. There definitely are also desires that should not be entertained in the sexual realm, for sure. Like, there are some people with some like freaky and horrifying fetishes that should definitely not be entertained and that should be suppressed. And I think more broadly, because now that I've made that point, I think what this article gets to is a deeper question that our society faces, which is it feels more and more like by the day now, our society is getting closer and closer to only valuing pleasure. That every action that we take can be reduced down at its base level to, is this going to give me more pleasure, either now or in the long run, or is this going to bring me pain? If so, I should avoid it. But that we're boiling down every action into one of those two things, which I think has been a change, first of all, over the history of our country, especially over the last 50 to 100 years. But more importantly, isn't a good change. I think it's a change that makes people's lives much more meaningless. And we can look to actually Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the existentialist authors, or I guess existentialism more broadly, is kind of an alternative approach to how life ought to be lived, right? Because Schopenhauer, prior to the existentialists, basically made this argument that, you know, life comes down to pleasure and pain, and those are the things that we should and do value. And that's what, you know, is the meaning in our life, or lack thereof. It just all boils down to pleasure and pain. And that was his essay on the vanity of existence. But then the existentialists came along and responded to that by saying that no, value in your life, what makes your life meaningful, what makes your life valuable, isn't given to you by the world. You can't find value from anywhere in the world. I mean, the world just is, right? The sky just is blue. It's not the sky should be blue or the sky should be this other color. It's just the sky is blue. And I just am here, and you just are there. And that the world will never tell you what should happen. And that to get to that question of should, of what's good, of what you should do, because you should do the good things and you shouldn't do the bad things, to get to that moral question, that fundamentally moral question, you have to take what they call a leap of faith, where you just subjectively decide. And, you know, there are Christian existentialists who argue that that leap of faith is to embrace what God decides is the good and the bad. And so in that case, your faith is being put into God as opposed to your own subjective determination of what the good and the bad are. But all this is to say, for Nietzsche, it's not a question of pleasure and pain. It's this question of subjective meaning creation. Like you yourself, the subject, are creating meaning in your own life, and you're deciding what is meaningful. And in that sense, it can kind of be thought of like through the, I guess there's an analogy like to climbing Mount Everest, right? Because I bet the people that climb Mount Everest, you know, find a lot of joy in that, find a lot of value in doing that. But it certainly isn't because it's a pleasant experience, right? It's certainly not that they get like a runner's high on the, you know, 25,000th foot, right? It's probably a horrifying experience and a scary one, and they're cold and they don't have good food and they can't breathe well and they have to carry all this stuff. But they do it because they've overcome an obstacle. It's a meaningful thing to them. And there's this value that's outside of that pleasure versus pain dichotomy. And I think this article really misses the boat on this. But let's talk about what I think is a good wrap up to the end of this article, because it really reflects, I think, what happens when somebody takes this author's advice. She ends the article talking, about her daughter and how she takes a lot of pleasure from her daughter. She says, "The pleasure my daughter gives me is untold, sometimes even disturbing." To clarify, she's talking about this in the sense of like, as a mother, her daughter gives her a lot of pleasure. "As if I tempted fate and stole something precious from the gods. And I confess, despite all this, I revived my occasional smoking habit again after she was born. I just wasn't willing to let the feeling fade away, not yet." And not a super insightful last part of the article, but I do think if you don't have that moral code that you may yourself create or that you find through religion, that you're tempted by these, by avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, and that results in you making actions that aren't necessarily good for yourself, both in this specific case for your health, but more broadly for the value that you will end up realizing in your life. So the final thing I'd like to go through is, or not even go through, just touch on, is the tweet of the day. I'd like to do a tweet of the day segment from here on out. So the tweet of today is a two-parter. It's an Elon Musk tweet. It's an Elon Musk retweet of Donald Trump's first tweet in 2 years, on Twitter, where he tweeted out this mugshot. I'm going to put a picture of it on the screen. But he tweeted out this mugshot, DonaldJTrump.com, and Elon Musk retweeted it and said next level, which is, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, and again, I'm trying to keep my own politics out of it, out of the show. I'm not going to say where I am on the political spectrum, but you have to admire the fact that this is a crazy moment, that Donald Trump is coming back into Twitter, which is one of the principal ways with which he has communicated with the American people in the past, and that this is an important, just an important historical moment in the context of this upcoming election, and I'm sure people on both sides would argue in the future of our country. All right, that wraps up the second episode of Mealtime News. I really appreciate you guys sticking around, coming for this journey. I'm trying to upload every day, even on weekends. We'll see. I'm human. I might miss some, but we're upgrading the setup every time. I'm the not so proud owner of 2 ring lights now, so we're upgrading. I got a printer, printed some stuff out. We're getting there. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.